go. We are off and rolling, Mr. Rainwater.
We've begun.
Which is oddly enough the topic for today's podcast.
How to
Uh, s-
begin.
yeah, so we are past Christmas now, and we are right on the cusp of New Year's. And I thought it would be a good time to start fresh in terms of art. So, like everybody, when they first start off the new year, has their New Year's resolutions. They're all
Right.
talking about they're going to lose weight, they're going to do this, they're going to do that, yada, yada, yada. Um, I wanted to talk today about the problems that we face as artists when it comes to either A, starting a new project, or B, just starting our day. Because I mean, I know this is true for me, and I'm guessing it's probably true for you as well. But if you're an artist, you have to be a self starter.
Yes.
There, there is no one with the whip cracking it on you. You have to be smacking yourself to get started.
Yeah.
Would you agree
Deadlines
with
can
that?
kind of help. Deadlines can kind of help with that, keeping that momentum. But I would say every day there is a point at about because my schedule is so weird right now. But like I usually don't start working until 1
Okay.
p.m., which is why I usually don't stop working until like 10 p.m. But anyway, there is a point where I'm just staring at the screen like, okay, when am I gonna start making lines happen? Like there is this weird moment when staring at a blank page where it's just like, I don't know how this is going to turn into what I want, what I imagine. It helps to have a process. Uh, it helps to have kind of a routine, but you also want to be careful of the routine too, because that can become sometimes it can become more of a hindrance than a help after a while. But nevertheless, having some kind of go-to, when you need to get moving. I
What
mean,
are
that's
what are
just
some of your go-tos? That's what I'm curious to know that because I know I have a couple.
it used to be caffeine, and then I have recently found that caffeine was not great for my health, so I can't rely on that anymore.
Fair enough.
I'm making it more about like having music. Like once I start music up and having good, like having some kind of music that's good for my blood flow gets me kind of pumped up or whatever. That helps. And that changes. There was like a good couple of months where I would basically when I started working was also happened to be when the Dave Ramsey show went live, and so there was like a couple of months where I was listening to the Dave Ramsey show because I was just interested in learning about finance, which is a complete other topic for artists or whatever. Very useful,
I've
to
never
listen to
even
that
heard of
show.
him. I'm not sure. I'm not sure who he is.
Yeah, he's most popular for helping people deal with like debt.
Okay.
So he has like a whole program that he gets people on like solving their debt issues, whether that's student loan debt, house debt, whatever, credit card,
Mm.
whatever. But he has really good sound financial advice, and it's sort of like approaching it from a very bare bones, basic sort of you start here and you move up and up and up your priority list. And his whole concept is sort of like you create like an avalanche of solving your debt problems by starting from the smallest and working to the biggest. I'll leave it at that. But anyway, yeah, so anyway, there was a couple of months where I did that, and that for whatever reason got my brain into the like I'm going to start working mode because and I think it might have something to do with because I've noticed this when I do listen to radio shows in general. Something about the idea of somebody knowing that somebody else is at work at the same time I'm at work gets my brain into that mode of like, all right, it's time to do stuff.
Like a
Um,
competitive mode?
it's not a competitive thing. It's like I don't know, like back when we were at SCAD, when you were in like a classroom scenario and other people were working at the same time, it
Yeah.
kind of is like that energy of like everybody's working, so like your gears
The
are naturally turning.
atmosphere.
Yes.
Yeah. it's like a communal vibe that kind of is not because we're creating, but it is created by the energy or like the vibes of everybody in the room. Like you can feel it. Like and one person can completely derail that entire thing. Or if you have somebody who's just
Yeah,
trying to be a class clown or something and everybody else is trying to work, they get one person to laugh and then it can break everybody else in the room. I know
exactly.
exactly what you're talking about. But
And
if
so
everybody's kind of like honed in, it's like easier for you to be like, "Oh,
yes.
okay, we're all doing something." I got you now.
So
Okay.
like if I want to start myself working at night, like if I have a late night because I haven't quite finished something, if Coast to Coast AM is on, which usually doesn't start until midnight, but if it's that kind of night where I'm working late, I'm putting on Coast to Coast AM because that runs from midnight to usually 4 a.m. So
Wow.
it's a good 4 hours of like,
Yeah.
paranormal talk show type stuff. And that all automatically will keep my brain like in a weird space anyway because it's odd topics, it's stuff that I'm gonna be pondering about through the rest of the night because I'm like, oh, is that true or is that real or whatever. But yeah, that's a great, for me it's been a great way of getting started is to have some kind of live program to listen to, so because
Mm.
it doesn't take up all my attention, it only takes up enough of the part of my brain that wants to be distracted from work basically.
Yes.
And
And
I
you
think
have to find a
that's,
balance of that too.
yeah, it's totally a balancing act because like I think that's part of that difficulty of getting started, that procrastination cycle is like when you want to start, I feel like generally most people's brains have like this distraction cycle where it's like, okay, but wait, first, let me check Twitter, let me check,
Yeah.
oh, do I need to go to the bathroom? Did I eat? Well, it's like kind of
Yeah.
running through, some of it's BS and some of it's, legitimate. But yeah, definitely making sure that particular monkey in the cage is like, got something to play with, something to do.
I am susceptible to the whole Facebook social media. Let me check a website. Oh, let me see that new trailer on YouTube.
Yeah.
Oh, did they put out a different trailer? This is the wrong trailer. Oh, like that kind of thing will suck me in and immediately. I found in terms of starting my day, the number one thing, and this kind of goes towards the not being distracted thing, and also I think kind of what you were talking about with um, the guy's podcast where he was like solve like one small piece of debt or whatever first. But
Yeah.
for me, it's about having clean surroundings. I
Oh,
cannot
yeah.
sit. I cannot even start if my desk has not been straightened out, cleared, thrown away. Like the soda cans from last night are been cleared away. The tissues are tossed in the garbage. The vacuum, like even the rug underneath my desk has to be vacuumed. Like I'll light a candle, maybe get the a scent going or something that will keep me focused. I know cinnamon is supposed to be like a focus scent. Um, the
Interesting. I didn't
lighting's
know.
it's granted it's still procrastination, but the lighting has to be right for me. So if like the overheads are killing me, I gotta put on just like the desk lamp with the soft white.
I'm
Um,
similar. Yeah, I relate to that a lot.
and the
Cause
heat, the
the
temperature of the room
heat's a
is
big
like one
one.
of the biggest things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Cause if I'm uncomfortable, like at
Mhm.
all, my brain will just be like, well, gotta figure that thing out. Gotta.
Yeah, it's distracting, and that's the thing that I think is the number one problem everybody has is that there's so many things fighting for your attention at any given moment, whether it's your to-do list for the week, the weekend, the day, whatever. Um, you really got to make sure that you have as many limited distractions as possible. But like you said, there's an importance to having good distraction in the room. So like when you were talking about when you sit down and you listen to a live thing, I assume at that point in time, you already have a plan of action for the day. Like you know what the story is and you know what you have to draw. You're not necessarily figuring it out. You're just kind of
Yeah.
do it. I don't want to call it busy work, but you're just executing, right?
Right. So that, I mean, that can go into the more general theme of starting things, which is having like you were saying, like having a plan of action and having everything broken down into steps. And this is something I feel like I actually learned about by being your roommate, because listening to you talk about like film production and what was involved in film production got me starting to think about, okay, how can I also break down all these steps in comics? Because I mean, what I learned from you in terms of like what goes on in film production is you basically have to have everything figured out before you even pull the trigger. Like you have to figure out like
Yeah.
where your actors are coming from, where all of your sets, all that stuff. Have all the ducks in a row before you get going.
Yep.
And so I had that mindset slowly has become more and more part of my daily routine. So like generally I have every like I'll do an episode of Trailer Park Warlock over the course of about a week. It's usually between 7 and 9 days.
Okay.
And what though, the actual day of the week, like Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, it changes. But I know based on, okay, I just finished an episode yesterday. Today I'm writing and I'm laying out the panels for all of my episodes after I write. And then I basically have the rest of the week falls into place after that, because then tomorrow I'm drawing a page and I'm going to be drawing pages for the next 4 to 5 days. And then after that, I'm flatting, coloring, um, doing dialogue, placing word balloons, and then laying it out. And so rinse, repeat. And then
And
that
but you know
cycle
what?
can be really useful for sure. But go
Yeah,
ahead, Joe.
and the fact that you're laying it out, and this is something also that kind of applies to film, or even just anything in general for art. I think is when you have you're developing that plan, but you break it down into little sub quadrants of things that need to be done. And this is another thing that I feel is really important when you are getting started. And this also applies to when I'm actually cleaning my surroundings in the morning and this and that. I could clean the night before and then come in, sit down, and just get started. But I feel like if I come in the morning and I clean first, checking off those boxes gives me momentum. It's
Hmm.
almost like, oh, look at so much I've already accomplished. Let me keep that. And it's just so much easier to keep going. Even though I haven't written a word, I haven't made an edit, I haven't done a single thing. But once I've accomplished a bunch of things in a row, it's so much easier to just keep going. And that's why when I actually get into work mode, one of the things that I don't do is stop and have lunch, because I've noticed quite often
Yeah.
that stopping for lunch, I will stop, I'll cook, I'll lay down, I'll put on an episode of a TV show, I'll eat, then I'll start making a little extra something like a snack for after, like a dessert for lunch. And then
Yeah.
I'm like, oh, I'm still eating, but the episode finished. Let me put on one more episode. And then, that just derails the day and it's all done.
That's the
So I
main reason why I don't start working until 1 most days, is because I don't want to have that intermediate period where I'm going to take lunch, and then that, like you were saying, it really does derail the momentum. Like I'll do in the morning, I'll do like social media stuff, because I mean it is technically work, but it's different, right? Like it's
yeah.
very, in a certain sense, it's low brain power. It's kind of just it's routine in a different way. Or I'll
Mhm.
do like video recordings for like Patreon stuff, or just other like random things that I know that I can do in like an hour to 30-minute chunks. But when it comes to like actually doing like the work, I'm like getting paid most of my money, most of my income comes from, that I know is going to
Yeah.
be between 6 to 8 hours a day kind of work. I want to have as few distractions for at least 4 to 5 hours. And
Yeah.
then after that 4 to 5 hour period, I'll usually take some kind of break to go exercise, um, to eat dinner, and then I'll start back up later on in the evening to finish off whatever I need to do.
And like you were saying, I like that schedule that you just kind of laid out, because while I'm not a big fan, I'm more of a fan of doing the exercise in the morning. That's just how my brain works. Because
Yeah.
again, that's one of my things that I like to check off. Because I know that it's done, and it also gives me freakishly wearing myself out in the morning gives me more energy through the day. I don't know how that works, but that's just how my body chemistry works, I guess. But um, I have noticed that when I do that kind of game plan, exactly like how you just laid out, when I stop for dinner, it's different from when I stop for lunch. And I don't know why, but when I come back from dinner, it's not so much usually finishing up what I was working on, it's more so setting the stage for the work that I'm going to do
Mm.
tomorrow so that you know what I mean? Like almost like I'm prepped for tomorrow's game plan. It's not like I said, I leave the desk in disarray, the soda cans, the tissues, whatever it may be. All that kind of stuff is there. But if I need to like make sure the files are in a certain folder and that something is rendering or this or that, then that's all the kind of stuff that I lay out after dinner. It's generally kind of like what you said, I don't want to call it busy work again, but like the things that are just kind of monotonous that I just need to check off and make sure
Yeah.
that are done, those things to me are on the opposite end of my schedule. That's the second half, not even half, quarter, I would say,
Yeah.
of my day. And then it's it's relaxing and downtime, because I feel like that's an important thing that a lot of artists struggle with is
Yes.
relaxation and the breath of getting away from your own work. Because I feel like if you're just so hard into it, you can burn yourself out, and it's just a you produce shit work, b you're not enjoying yourself, so why are you even doing this, c um you end up redoing most of that work anyway. You know what I mean? Like there's
That's my current issue right now is figuring out how to turn my brain off at the end of the day because that has got me into trouble where I end up having like, oh, I'm done with my main tasks. I'm gonna make up new things to do, which is like the worst thing because then I end up with just having more projects that take up even more time. So I definitely, I definitely would also second what you're saying and encourage like finding some way to turn off your brain. And
Hmm,
it's different for everybody. That's why I generally will do exercise in the evening because that's a pretty it's
okay.
an easy way for me to get my brain into that mode of like, okay, my back is feeling sore, or like I've been sitting in a chair all day. I need to go move my body and do something to just switch gears and go to Planet Fitness and watch the 7 or 8 TV screens with Food Network or Fox News or whatever the hell.
Now, you were talking about thinking about other things, and that's something that I really wanted to get into this episode was, and we've all had this problem. I don't even have to ask you, but when you sit down to start working, and we're talking about new projects now, because it's new year, new projects, new me, yada yada yada, all that stuff.
Yeah.
Um, where do you find your muse? Because a lot of people will sit down and say, I don't know what to draw. I don't know what to write. I don't know what to like, and that you're just
Yeah.
blank. Do you have like a common muse that that you can tap into, or a source that kind of generates the ideas in your head? Because for me, my muse is music. When I'm on the
That makes
treadmill,
sense. Yeah.
I can be listening to, and it doesn't matter if it's like Def Leppard or Hans Zimmer. When I'm there, I'm listening to it, and my brain, it's creating, and I don't know,
Yeah.
and I'm starting to see things, and it's not so much like tied to the lyrics, but more so the vibe of the music. And I'm
Yeah.
just like, oh, this is the moment when this character does that. That will be cool for this. This is when, okay, then that happens. And then I start putting the song on loop, and then I'm like filling in blanks. Then I go back and I look at the length of the song. I'm like, okay, it's 3 minutes song, so that the action sequence is 3 minutes and da 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 da. So, and it could be completely com, um counterintuitive to what you would think. Like I would be listening to um a song from Mad Max Fury Road, and
Mhm.
I could imagine like a karate sequence going to it. And then I could be listening to a song from a Transformers movie, and I'm picturing like a guy holding his loved one in his arms as they pass away. Like it's like these
Yeah.
weird amalgamation of different ideas that just kind of pop up in my head. And as I listen to music, and usually it's treadmill time, when I get most of them. And then I come in and I'm like, okay, that's that card. And I put it up on my beat board, or I start writing that scene, or I start drawing a storyboard, or whatever it may be.
Yeah.
So for me, music is my number one. I'm curious to know if it's the same for you, or if you have a different way to
Music
inspire
is
ideas.
definitely one. Um, I also, I mean, I'm also the kind of person where I will, like today I traveled because I was visiting my dad the last couple of weeks in Baton Rouge, and then traveling back to where I'm staying in Lake Charles today. It was about a 2.5 hour drive. So during that particular period of time, I'm listening to music, but also just like the rhythm of being in a drive,
Mm,
I will start to think about a lot of general life stuff, but then I'll also start thinking about creative stuff because that's, a constant on my mind. So like today, like I spent a lot of that time thinking about future story arcs in Trailer Park Warlock, or how am I gonna conclude this project that I'm working on, et cetera, et cetera. So that's like even just driving around town, just doing errands or whatever,
sure.
there's I don't, I've always had this analogy of like, I'll just say it's like, this is the name I use for like the subconscious part of my mind or whatever, but I like to call it the percolator, where it's just like off in the
Yes.
background, just, things are bubbling,
Yeah.
you don't know what's going to come up. So eventually, something will happen. And that's helped. Meditation, I've legitimately like used meditation as a tool to like come up with ideas, or to find ideas from unexpected places. That's a whole rabbit hole in itself. But another
I,
place that's been interesting has been, especially for story writing, has been tarot cards. So
I was literally just about to ask you that because I know you were saying you used it to like tap into your subconscious for like
yeah.
personal things, but I was very curious to see if you had used it for Trailer Park Warlock because I mean it's right there, it's a subject matter, right? Like it's
Yeah.
involved with that kind
Well,
of.
and especially because tarot cards are like, they're literally just a stack of archetypes. Like it's just a stack of story archetypes, and so you just shuffle and draw a hand, or draw three or whatever, and you can immediately sort of start connecting dots based on the illustrations that show up in front of you. And you go, oh, okay, like maybe this character a will have like a major changing moment, and it could go in this direction. So I've done that a couple of times, and like,
How's it worked out story wise?
it's
Has
worked
it been
out
well
pretty good.
received?
Like, what's that?
Has it been well received?
Oh yeah, I mean, it never. And here's the other thing: is like, it's there are aspects of it where it's like, I won't take every part of this reading, or whatever you want to call it, like,
Yeah.
but it's just something to get the gears turning. And like, there's another tool that I use every once in a while. It's called I always forget the name of it. It's called Oblique Strategies. So it's another deck of cards, but it was designed by the music producer and musician Brian Eno and a friend of his. And they basically made a deck of cards with very like abstract phrases. So the whole point of it is just to like, kind of like how I was using the tarot just now, is to just to get your gears turning by offering up like just weird phrases. I just pulled it up right now and I drew a card, and so the card it brought up just says, cut a vital connection. Well, you can go in a lot of different directions with that little
Yeah.
idea, right? Oh, maybe that's the main character. Maybe he has a major relationship that maybe in the story I could, cut off that relationship now, or whatever. The whole idea is just to like get your brain outside of its normal parameter of operation so that you can start thinking in a more creative sense, because it seems like that's the thing that sparks creativity most readily, is when you're sort of outside of your normal operating parameters, when you get into that place of like, Oh, okay. I didn't think about it that way. Let's keep going with that thread. Where does it go to next? And then after that, and then after that. And
Let
of
me ask
course,
a
like
question
yeah, go ahead.
before you get too far with that. Let me
Yeah.
ask a question. How often do you do this? Because I do this all the fucking time. Um, how often do you start doubting yourself when you're going down a particular thread? Do you ever stop and think to yourself, "Oh, well, that's obvious. That's the next place to go. The audience is going to
Yeah.
get or is going to see that coming." And then you're kind of hesitant to go at it. But then like sometimes when you do and you're like, "Oh, that's the obvious place to go." And they're like, "Oh, I didn't see that coming." Because
Yeah.
to me, it's all obvious, and I can't decipher what is the creative left
Yeah.
turn and what's not because you know what I mean. Like my brain just gets it, and I, most of the time when I write stuff, I think it's pretty obvious where it's going, and people like miss tiny details, or maybe they're underestimating how much attention to detail I'm putting into the writing. Because like I'll look at a sentence of dialogue and I'll be like, I need to change that one word, and if I change that one word, it won't. It'll definitely nail down the theme, and people will get it more. And people don't think that it's anything. So like sometimes I'm reading too far into it, and then sometimes I'm not reading far enough. I'm
That's
curious to know how that thought process works for you.
yeah, I mean, I think over time I'm sort of coming to this place where I can no longer predict what the audience is going to think. So I'm going to try and do what I wouldn't predict necessarily. But it depends. It depends because so in the current season of Trailer Park Warlock, I've had this thing building up in the story arc where these two characters are going to like duel each other. And for a long time I was like, nah, I'm gonna troll them and not do it because I want to go with the unexpected. And then the last 2 weeks is like, no, I'm gonna do it. Like I'm gonna do it because it's time. Like I've been building up towards this. I'm actually like really looking forward to it. And so that's kind of how I'm starting to approach this. Like, well, if it seems fun to me, I should do it. Because otherwise
Yeah,
I'd be withholding the good stuff from myself. So what's even the point,
yeah.
Like there is a certain amount of how I will approach it that will be kind of selfish, where it's like, well, I want to do this because it would be fun for me, and I'm applying myself, any given amount of time a day, so I want to make sure that it's worth it for myself. And if it's worth it for myself, odds are good that that will also like rub off on the audience, basically. Like if I'm
See,
having fun, they will hopefully have fun too.
I face a different dilemma as a filmmaker because um I violated the true artist nature of my craft at one point. I've since changed it, but so I was writing my horror feature Haunted, and there was a friend of mine playing a role. And when you're in when you're making a film these days, even an independent film, especially when you're making a genre film like a horror film, the talk of sequels and follow-ups and continuations always tends to come up. And I had cast a friend in this role, and in my mind as I was working through the script on rewrites and so on and so forth, I got to a point where I was like, oh, they need to die. They need to die right there in this point of the script. But then I didn't do it because I was like, oh, that means so and so's not going to be in the sequel. I don't want to rob them of that opportunity. So I
Yeah.
just didn't do it. And then, and then it eventually it worked out where I rewrote it, and now that character does die. Spoiler alert, but you don't know what character. Haha. But it's one of those things where I do know what you're saying about trying to guesstimate what the audience is going to like or not like or see coming. And I have started doing exactly what you said, where it's just like, I'm just going to do what I think is cool, what I'm entertained by, because you just can't. I mean, it's important to be in touch with your audience. Don't get me wrong. But at the same time, you really can't second guess what they're picking up on in a
Yeah.
particular watch or read or whatever it may be
Yeah,
that
exactly.
is there. Because like if you put something in a film, there we've all seen the videos on YouTube where it's like, oh, these small details that we missed, but if you go back and you watch it again, you can pick up on certain things and this and that. So it's one of those things where I've stopped guessing, oh, I wonder if this will go over well or not. It's just, oh, I like that. That's cool. Or,
Yeah.
oh, that sucks. That hurts me in my soul. I love it. I'm going to make everybody else feel that way too. Like that's my approach to everything now. Um, but I
Yeah,
definitely want to talk.
it's a delicate tightrope walk, or I don't know if it's a tightrope walk, but it's like you have to kind of, I don't know, like for me, I'm trying to get into where I'm approaching it like a dance, where it's like sometimes I take the lead and sometimes the audience takes the lead on how I'm going to approach the
That's good.
stories that I'm
I like
doing.
that.
And it really depends on how I feel towards what they're saying. So like what the thing I was talking about with this season, well, these two characters are going to duel. Like there were a lot of comments I was reading of people just being like really amped for the duel, and that was initially my reason to not want to do it. And I realized like, okay, the reason why I don't want to do it is just to like snub my nose at my audience, even though I think it would be fun to do it. And so that's where I have to kind of reapproach it in that dance mentality of like, well, hold on. If you and your audience are in the same vibe, just go with that. And it'll probably be great because everybody will have fun. And that's really the thing that you want above all. At least when it comes to, like a humorous comic book.
Now, here's a problem that I face, and this is I think one of the hardest things that a lot of people face when they get into. So we talked about starting. So you got your everything set up, you've got an idea or two, and you're so enthusiastic about it, you're so jazzed, you love it, you think the audience is going to love it, and then you sit down and you either write it or you draw it, and you
Yeah.
start to realize, oh man, I have, 22 more pages to fill up and I've already shot my wad on this idea. Now what? You know what I mean? Like that is a
Yeah.
problem that I face a lot. So I'm curious to know your take on how you handle that because I know when I do it, it's really I'm a get into the weeds kind of guy. I like to start examining the conflict of what's going on out of that idea. It's like, okay, here's my idea. So this creates a problem that this character has to solve. Well, in order to solve it, they need to have this tool. How do they get that tool? How does that tool work? Does the tool do this? Where's the tool hidden? Do they have to get through this to get to that tool?
Right.
It's almost like a video game in my head where I start breaking down levels where it's like, oh, you got to go backwards from the idea and then work towards the idea. And then after it's like, okay, he just killed the bad guy. Now what? What happens? There's no more conflict. Well, what if this person shows up and they're pissed off that they killed you know what I mean? Like it's
Yeah.
starting to examine the fallout of that conflict. Like I really start fleshing out the itty bitty details of any kind of idea that I have just because I have to fill in more time, but I also feel like it makes it more, and this is important in film. And one day I'll go into more detail about this in a different podcast. But realism, not so much realism. They'd call it the suspension of disbelief, but it's really just about immersing your characters in a believable world. It doesn't have to be real, it just has to be
Yeah.
believable within that world. So I feel like if I flesh that stuff out, then the ideas that however crazy and far out that they may be, I have fleshed out how they happen, why they happen, when they happen, who they happen to, what happens because of it, etc. And that seems to fill a lot of the voids for me in terms of it. And then I like also when I have two different bullet points of two crazy disconnected ideas that I've thought up, like, oh, this house explodes, but then this girl turns into a turtle. Like that's never anything that I've ever written. But somehow in filling out the void of how she turned into a turtle, I can somehow catch a line where I can connect that to the house blowing up. And that's when the magic is for me. When I start putting things together, and usually that's when I start realizing whatever the subconscious theme of the
Yeah.
story I was trying to tell is
Yeah.
starts coming to the surface in my head. And then once I realize that, I'm like, oh, this is about relationships. This is about love. This is about forgiveness, whatever the theme may be. And then I start looking at the other ideas that I might have posted up on the board. And I'm like, okay, how do I pull love or forgiveness out of that action sequence that I just wrote? He's shooting at a guy on top of a train. How do I milk that for the theme of
Yeah.
forgiveness? You know what I mean? Like, and that's where I start, like, again, that momentum, that rolling, that's how I start flowing. So I'm curious to know what it is that you do when you have to fill those voids.
Good. That's a
I
very
know I
good
just filled the
question.
whole void by my rant. I was hoping you would
Um
come with an answer in that time, but it's still a very difficult question or to answer.
well, that's usually when I go towards we had talked about this in a previous podcast about like having ideas for other like for other
Oh yeah,
projects.
right.
That's usually when I pull into the toolbox of like, oh, what are other things that I was going to use for other projects? Like, because I'm now taking this mentality lately of, I'm not going to worry about that later project. It may never happen. Let's use it right now. Like, now's the
Good idea.
time because I could be dead or something. You know what I mean? Like, the embracing the moment is more the thing to do, because or I might have better ideas later on that will totally outstrip whatever I had in my back pocket that I was like, waiting on to be this big thing later on. Like, don't worry about it. There'll be other ideas later on. And so that has been lately really helping me stay stay out of that zone of like being like, oh, I don't know what to do now. Granted, it does happen. So like I might, if I'm just like not sure what to do in the moment, I might walk away from the table for a second, Like I might go do something else. That might be time for me to go exercise and wait for or meditate or whatever and wait for the new ideas to come in, which is not exactly useful help. I
No.
recognize, because I'm saying like, it'll just come to you like magic. And
But at the
like,
same time, it goes back to what we were saying about stepping away from your work. Because if
yeah,
you do, because sometimes I'm convinced that that like creative blocks, when you hit that roadblock, sometimes that's just burnout, and you have to be able to admit to yourself that you're working too much, you're working too hard, you're working too long, you're overthinking stuff, you're too paranoid about whether it's going to work or whether or not you've executed correctly. And sometimes you just need to take a step back, go, drink something, eat something, go for a walk, play with your dog, get laid, whatever it may be. You just
right.
need to stop and get away from your project. And then somehow that love, here's the number one thing that I do when I feel like I'm in a creative block. I go do something that I don't want to do, that I have to do,
Yeah.
because inevitably when I'm raking leaves or cleaning my car or whatever it may be, whatever menial task it is, if you have a job that's not immediate, like you're not doing your art as a full-time job, if you're flipping burgers at McDonald's, that's usually when you're thinking to yourself, I would much rather be writing right now. I
Yeah.
would much rather be drawing or blah 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 blah. So what I do is I use that I don't want to call it annoyedness because that's not a word. That irritance
Hmm.
of I don't want to be doing this to kickstart an idea in my head. And almost 9 times out of 10 it works. Like I will go and I will take the dog out for a walk. I will clean the kitchen, do the dishes, whatever that annoying chore that I
Yeah.
have to do at some point today. I go and I do that. And then when I start doing that, that momentum, like I said, about cleaning and doing all that kind of stuff, getting something done, that starts moving me. And then I'm also thinking, I'm like, oh, what if my character is doing the dishes or something stupid like that?
Yeah.
That might not end up being the scene, the character doing the dishes. But if I think about how my character would be doing the dishes, then it might lead to a next idea and the next idea and the next idea. And then I'll hit something and
Yeah.
it's like, oh, that's what needs to happen. And then I'll come running downstairs and I'll start working.
Yeah, and that kind of goes back to something that I think about often, which is that an artist's perceived experienced life is their best resource for their work, because that's where all the most intense like feelings and thoughts are going to come from, and they're going to originate from, because that's where you can that's the ground from which everything can kind of grow up from, basically. So I mean, I really like what you're saying there, because whether it's doing, errands, menial tasks around the house or whatever, or going to go visit a friend or family, like at some point during the day, during that experience, you're going to have an observation that leads to some amount of revelation, or some
Yeah.
amount of insight.
Well, because I think as artists, one of the things, and you kind of touched on this earlier, our brains never turn off the
Yeah.
project. It's a blessing and a curse at the same time, because
Yeah.
like I'll find myself talking about Haunted or Indom or whatever project is currently on my agenda. I will be thinking about that while I'm cooking dinner. I will be thinking about that when I'm driving to the post office. Whatever it may be, it's always on my mind. Even I could be laying in bed watching The Office, and I'll be like, oh, that would be a good idea for me to steal, because a lot of the things, I I am what a lot of people could consider to be either pretentious or snobby or whatever it may be, like just completely impossible to please when it comes to television and movies and stuff, because I'm always looking at it as not that I could have done it better, but I would have done it differently.
Mhm.
So I'll look at a premise or a setup or something in a television show, and I'll just be like, I don't think they grasped that idea's full potential. I can do it better. And then that ego kind of kicks in, but then it starts becoming not so much about stealing an idea, but it's about taking someone's initial idea and doing your own spin on it. And
Yeah.
I've found that that can be very fruitful in terms of how you can pull ideas that have a concrete base in their execution in terms of how they work. Like you watch The Office and they do the mockumentary format, and you're like, okay, this works. People respond to this.
Yeah.
It's okay. But they're missing a joke here, and they could do this with that kind of format, and they could do this and that and this. And that's how I kind of spurred into doing digits, was just this idea of like an AV kid doing his project of about his friends, and it turns into, oh, they got their first date, and then and it kind of
Yeah.
snowballed from there. So it was taking an idea that was not mine and just saying, oh, this is how I would do that, and suddenly it becomes its own thing.
I would definitely make the argument that is probably, if you look at art history from like a very generalized perspective, that's how it's always been. Like
Yeah.
it was really interesting for me to learn, like this is back in college, but to learn that, like, so like the Greeks are known for their columns, right? Well, it turns out the reason they even have columns in the first place is because most of the ancient Greeks would go to Egypt to work as like masons, stoneworkers, and the Egyptians had columns before them. So
Huh.
they learned from the Egyptians and then made their own version. So they basically responded to their art, and they were like, "Oh, okay, well, Egypt, they have these columns. Let's do our own version." And then the
Yeah.
Romans did that later on, and then after the Romans, there were the Italians, and so on and so forth. And that's the history of just the column, right? Like
Yeah.
that's just like a little trope in architecture. And that is the same with, you could track the history of comics. Like
Food.
all of food, yes, absolutely. Like food in terms of like France had such a huge impact on like culinary arts that like even stuff that you wouldn't think would be that big of a deal is like something that was sort of originated from, I'm sure before the French culinary arts, they probably took a bunch of stuff from a lot of other cultures at that time. But
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, that for me is sort of like, it is a big influence for me of thinking about my own inspirations. Like I have like Gendy Tartakovsky, who is an animation director,
Mm.
has had a huge influence on me in terms of somebody who I will think about when I'm like when I'm kind of wanting to look for new ideas or new scenes, because he's somebody who has gone kind of outside of the normal range of like
Yeah.
what you would see on TV animation. He did like Samurai Jack, and his newest thing is Primal, which is I love Primal because there's no dialogue and it's just violence. So it's just pure animated violence. And anyway, my whole point being like I think that response to another artist's work is a great like igniter for a lot of
Mhm.
people. Because like for me, like I started drawing because I wanted to draw like video game stuff. Like I think the first one of the first characters I ever drew when I was like 5 was Kirby.
Wow.
Because I had played Kirby's Adventure on the NES, and like for whatever reason that game emotionally impacted me, as you know,
Yeah.
as happens to kids. And so that was like what I drew, and then like after that it was like Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, and I was like, well, I'm going to make Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, but they're mice. So they're Teenage Mutant Ninja Mice. But anyway, that's like there's a lot of art that is like sort of a process of mutation, where it's like,
Yeah.
you know, oh, it's the same thing. I mean, actual history of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles is it was originally either a parody of Daredevil or X-Men or both. It was the story kind of gets
Yeah.
a little bit fuzzy, but from what I understand, like it was supposed to initially be a parody of Daredevil, and so it kind of went from there. So that's
That's
another example
interesting.
of like how artists responding to other art, you know, um, yeah, the
You
artist
do have
responding
to
to
you
thing.
do have to walk a fine line though, because there's a difference between being inspired by and derivative and ripping off and all that kind of stuff. Like
Yeah,
there's definitely a tight walk to do there. Most of the time I think if you're doing it for the right reason, um it can't be like if you're doing it because like the going in Hollywood is, oh look, Jaws made this much money, we need more Jaws movies, Jaws 2, and then the other studio's like, we need sharks,
yeah.
sharks, 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 put sharks in this movie right now. And that's derivative,
Yeah,
that's a
I would
cash
argue
grab,
that's where all
that's
the worst creative impulses come from for sure. When it's like, oh, that's what's popular, I should do a version of that too. And it's like,
yeah.
oh, unless you have like a really poppin' idea, like
Oh
don't,
yeah.
you know,
Like,
but
yeah, you look at the superhero boom in movies right now, and it's like, oh, the Avengers was this giant, global hit, the first Avengers movie.
yeah.
And then immediately you started seeing DC talking about a DC universe, and you're just like, oh no. You guys could have done this so much earlier. Like, we've been waiting for this, but don't do it like this. And they're like, no, we're not even gonna do the setup movies. We're just gonna jump right to it. No, don't. You're not gonna get what you think you're getting here.
Uh,
And it's that short-sighted type of view. But I think when you tap into something where, and this is oddly enough, I was talking to someone today about our podcast, and they said to me they were interested that, or they were not disappointed, but they wanted to know in our intro podcast that you and I did not get into what spurred us into becoming the artists of our
yeah.
particular medium. And you just touched on that a little bit with the Kirby thing. I don't know if that's the definite thing. I know for me, I was at a movie theater with my mom and I was watching Jurassic Park. And I
Oh,
remember
good.
when the Brontosaurus came on screen, the Brachiosaurus. I don't know what the hell it's called now. The name changes like every week.
Right.
Um, but when it came on screen, I remember being a little kid looking up at the screen in absolute awe, thinking, wow, that's incredible. And I remember walking out of the theater thinking to myself, I know what I want to do with the rest of my life. I want to make movies so that people can feel the way I just felt.
Yeah.
Like it didn't matter that, maybe my friend was on vacation and I was lonely, or I, had just like failed a test or something like that. This feeling came over me by watching pictures on a screen. and it changed my life. And it's
Yeah.
crazy to think about like that, but for me that was what it was. So like when I start thinking about starting a concept, my gut thing is my very first thing when I start a production, when I start a script, when I start anything, I go back to Jurassic Park. That's the first thing I do. And I watch Jurassic Park and I just kind of try and it doesn't always work because you become dull to that sense of
Yeah.
what you've seen a million times. But I watch it and I try to mind my own feelings and find that sense of wonder or awe that sparked me.
Yeah.
So I'm curious to know if is it Kirby for you, or does anything from that from your
That's
history of
my
what inspired you to become an artist, is that anything you ever tap into?
that's definitely, I would say, like that whole story about Kirby's Adventure, that's probably the first instance that I can think of that I can trace of like, oh, I did this thing and then I wanted to start drawing.
Mm,
And I mean, there's plenty of other examples of things that influenced me, but I
sure.
probably wasn't as consciously aware of because like my grandparents would regularly, like routinely buy like Disney VHSs and Looney Tunes. So like I watched Looney Tunes daily. Like it was my church for like a long time.
Okay.
Uh which is something I did not like, I was not really that aware of until very recently. I started thinking about it. I actually went back to watching like Looney Tunes cartoons recently just to kind of like re-engage
Yeah.
with that early influence. And like it ended up helping because it kind of got me back on track of like what are the things that I really like, because I've basically watched all of the Looney Tunes cartoons, and just having that, I mean, it's kind of a nostalgia thing, right?
Sure.
Like of,
Yeah.
oh, I remember this part, I remember that. But then it's also like re-engaging it with sort of fresh eyes of like, now I look at it in a new way of where I'm thinking about the artistry that went into it, of
Okay.
like the amount of time and effort and the kind of knowledge that goes into like designing the characters, making the backgrounds, all the particularities, like something I never even paid attention to as a child, and now I can see 100% is different animation directors, like the styles that the animation directors have. Certain animation directors, like Chuck Jones, they don't like naturalistic backgrounds, while others, like Tex Avery, loves naturalistic backgrounds, and it actually creates a totally different vibe on the cartoon. That was something it never even occurred to me, and I can actually like think in an applicable way in terms of making comics. Um, so yeah, I mean, like re-engaging those first loves definitely like. I mean, it's always important, but it can after. I think you were kind of saying like after a while it can get dull for sure, and I'm currently like in the process of trying to find like new inspirational sources, because I kind of miss that feeling, and
Yeah.
like
Yeah. You're chasing it.
I've
I
I've
guess you.
had this I've had this process of like artists who I really appreciate, learning about their humanity some and being less interested in them, but also just like being so familiar with them to the point of like, oh well, I'm kind of, you're not new or interesting anymore. I hate to say
Sure.
it like that, but
Yeah.
for a long time a huge influence on me was Alan Moore, and like he wrote the comics Watchmen, he wrote a lot of Swamp Thing and a bunch of other, he's prolific. Well,
Yeah.
anyway, he's probably the only artist I would say that like I feel like I have at a certain point a personal connection with him, which is a creepy Stan thing to say, but like
Okay.
what happened is like he wrote a book. It took him 10 years to write, and it's called Jerusalem. It's a 1,300-page book. It took me 3 years to read.
Wow.
It is like this super personal work his um about his hometown. It's called Northampton. It's in the United Kingdom. And by the end of the book, after I was done reading it, I was like, I know too much about this person now. Like I can't, I know way too much about him. He wrote this beautiful, like it's a beautiful book. It's amazing. But at the end of the book, I was like, I guess I'm done with Alan Moore. Like I don't I don't
I
I don't need
think
any more here.
I think because, and this goes back to our very first podcast when I talk about every artist just trying to work their shit out.
Yeah.
Um, I feel like what you're saying, because then one of the things about each artist that I believe is that they're thirsting to understand things that are in front of them, whether it be an artist or the artwork. And
Yeah.
once you've grasped it, whether or not they have grasped it themselves, once you have grasped it, you've kind of assimilated that information, that craftsmanship, that style, whatever it may be, and now you're ready to move on because it's just another tool in your toolkit.
Yeah.
Like for me, Spielberg was one that was, that kickstarted me for Jurassic Park. But then um Scream, the horror movie,
Yeah.
was one of the most formative things in my life as a kid. I wanted to see that movie so bad. When I finally got to see it, it delivered. And horror became a giant thing on me. I was reading Goosebump books like nonstop. It was, you know what I mean? Like it
Yeah.
sucked me into the world of horror. And so now horror and Spielberg, like Wes Craven, Spielberg, all that kind of stuff starts mixing together. And then as I moved on, I found other movies like, say, Willy Wonka with Gene Wilder and that like
Oh yeah.
absurdist, sarcastic comedy. Like all these things start becoming like this big melting pot of my
Well,
style.
can I talk with you about a current like it's not really a project, it's like a weird mental experiment I'm doing right now. So,
Absolutely. I want to hear
because
anything you're doing that's weird, we need to talk about. That's what
okay,
this podcast is about.
so currently because I'm trying to figure out where I should look for new inspiration, I've been looking at um the
Doing
birth
drugs.
signs for all of the like creative people who have influenced me. So like
Interesting.
yeah, so
You're talking
it
about like
well
Cancer, Sagittarius, Taurus, that kind of
it
stuff?
gets even more interesting, okay? So
Go for
like
it.
all of my favorite writers currently are Aquarians. Like straight
Okay.
up. It is fucking weird. Like all of my favorite musicians are earth signs. So David Bowie's a Capricorn, Frank Zappa's a Capricorn, David Byrne's a Taurus, Brian Eno's a Taurus. Brian Eno and David Byrne are not, yeah, Brian Eno and David Byrne, they have a birthday one day away from each other. So, okay, so beyond that, Alan Moore is a Scorpio. Terrence McKenna, who's a philosopher who's majorly impacted me, is a Scorpio. Um, and then there's another musician by the name of Yoko Kanno who's a Pisces. So like I was looking at this as like, okay, there's one exception to this who isn't like either a water sign, an earth sign, or an air sign, and that's what is his name? He's the guy who made the anime art, the manga and the anime Akira, Katsuhiro Otomo. Oh, and the guy who did Dragon Ball Z. He's also a fire sign, but I can't remember. I think he's an Aries. Anyway, my point being, when I was looking at it, I was like, okay, so the general spread is like I have, for whatever reason, all of my musical like inspirations, because music, all my musical inspirations are earth signs for some reason. All of my philosophical inspirations, for the most part, are air signs. I don't know why. I don't know how this happens. And then there's like this mid range of water signs that like are also inspirations for me. And then there are a couple of fire signs, but not as many. And astrologically speaking, as far as I'm aware, fire and earth signs, I'm a Virgo, so I'm an earth sign. Fire and earth signs are neutral to each other, so they don't really have a lot of impact. They just, I'm like, they get along, but it's not like, it's kind of like meh.
Okay.
Um, this is what's weird though, is like air signs and earth signs are supposed to be total opposites of each other. So I don't understand why I'm like, if this, according to this system of thought, is it just I'm fascinated by the contrast? You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
oh, furthermore, Dave Ramsey, right? He's a Virgo. So it's all like, I don't
That's
know if
weird.
it's supposed to make sense, but like, doing this project has kind of gotten myself into this weird mindset of like, okay, maybe I should look for artists based on their birth sign and see if I find the next thing.
I can't knock that, because I mean, a part of being an artist is kind of using scientific method, whether you're using math or you're using like the scientific what is it called? Scientific what is it called? Where you have a hypothesis, a control,
That's a scientific method, isn't it?
yeah, yeah, scientific method. Thank you. That's actually a big part of being an artist, is kind of experimenting with stuff and whether or not, like, because I'll look at things. It's equally as weird as you doing the astrological science things.
Yeah.
I will pull out scripts to movies that are inspirational to me for whatever it is that I'm working on, and I will start looking at page numbers, and I will say, oh, on this page, this kind of thing happens to this guy, and on this script, that page, this happens to this guy. So on this page of mine, this should happen here. Like, and then I start like connecting dots, and I'm like, wow, I wonder why that works like that. And then I start realizing that like Jaws and um I don't know, some other movie that's completely unrelated to Jaws, Scream. We'll say Scream. I start seeing parallels between a serial killer movie and a killer shark movie, and I'm like, wow, that's kind of crazy. Maybe I need to start looking at it like this. And then I start putting dots together. And that's again how I problem solve sometimes, is looking at weird little experimentation things where it's like, I didn't notice that these things coincide with one another, but they do. Or
Yeah.
at least in my brain they do. So like then I start looking for different sources that could do this and could do that to kind of validate my theory. So I understand 100% what you're
Yeah.
saying.
That's half the reason why I've been getting into all the like woo stuff lately, is just to like break my head out of normal routine processes.
Yeah.
And like, I get it, a lot of people feel weird or awkward about that because they're like, well, what if you get too into it and it gets culty? And it's like, well,
Yeah.
you find an out. You make sure
Yeah.
you have a parachute.
One of the
But
biggest things about being an artist, I think, is self-awareness and being
yeah.
able to unbiasedly tell yourself, you've gone off the deep end, you've gone too far, stop. Just
Yeah.
take a step back, admit you were wrong, and turn the pencil over, start erasing. Like it's just
Exactly.
that's
But it's
part.
like it's really, I mean, and so going back to sort of the main theme of this episode, like, and I would say this in terms of not for daily routine, but for starting projects from the grander perspective, like starting brand new.
Yeah.
I think it's part of how I do that is by having a record of all these like bigger mental experiments that I do over time, or having those kernels of an idea that comes from all of the weird going outside the norm experiences, because that's where all the that's where all the good stuff is often.
Going to places where you're uncomfortable,
Yeah.
I think is a nice way to kind of, because I think one of the biggest things for an artist is to experience things that they don't normally experience, to step out of comfort zones and do things that you're afraid of or that you just don't know about, and be humble enough to be able to like ask questions. Like, you
Yeah.
step into it or whatever. And I'm not saying you should like go kill somebody if you're writing a horror movie or whatever, but like doing research beyond listening to like murder mystery podcasts or that kind of the Netflix series about serial killers or this or that. There's a step beyond that where you start like looking into like psychology of serial killers and understanding the thought process, the backstory, all that kind of stuff. Stepping into that kind of comfort zone, uncomfort zone, where you're just completely out of your league, can definitely kickstart ideas.
Absolutely. Like
It's almost like fertilizer.
yeah, for sure. Sorry, my brain, I went into a brain fart just now.
The Taco Bell.
It definitely is.
But okay, so the last thing that I wanted to touch on, and this is
Yeah.
something that I discovered, believe it or not, in terms of being able to stay productive when you're starting something or you're getting going or whatever. I didn't I didn't naturally observe this. This is something that I came across. Somebody retweeted it, whatever it was. There is supposedly, and you may know this, only so much creativity juice in your brain per day.
Oh
And
yeah.
a lot of that comes out of choice making, like decision making. So every time you make some kind of a decision, you disable yourself from being able to create more. So when you wake up in the morning and you take a shower, when you pick out what shirt you're going to wear that day, you have just zapped some of your creative juice. When you decide whether or not what you're having for breakfast, whether it's toast or
Yeah.
cereal, you've just zapped some of that juice. If you put chocolate milk or orange juice, zap some of that juice. You know what I mean? Like,
This is
so
a
what I
great thing to
do,
bring up because I've been dealing with like the last, I don't know, probably the last month I've been dealing with some major decision fatigue. Because there are a lot of different things where I'm like, just in terms of like, stuff, life stuff, buying a
okay,
car, a house, whatever. Like, I'm
yeah,
in a position to buy a car, and I cannot, for the life of me, get myself into that mindset because of all of the decisions necessary to like, okay, what's its mileage? What's the safety rating? Blah blah blah. Like at a certain point, I'm like, can you just can somebody just order it for me? I don't know. I'll just Uber everywhere from now on. But yeah, I mean, I relate a lot to what you're saying because writing a story, just writing a story, is a decision a minute because
yep,
you're making decisions based on how am I going to make sure this is entertaining for the reader or the
yep,
audience? How am I going to make sure that this makes sense? Like how,
yeah.
like is this
No
grounded?
plot holes, sure.
And then on top of that, you're also keeping all the dots connected of the story in its entirety from beginning to end. You're
Yeah,
constantly having to replay all the events, making like fact checking, double checking, constantly. So as you get further, closer and closer to the end of the project, it becomes more and more difficult to make a decision because every decision from that point on becomes ever more significant
yes.
and requires ever more like troubleshooting, basically, for lack of a better word, because
Mm.
at a certain point, like I don't for you, like I don't know if you relate to what I'm saying, but for you, have you had scripts in the past where you're just like, as you're getting into it, like it's a nightmare to like make
Absolutely.
sure
Almost
all the
every single
dots
script.
connect?
Because and the biggest problem is if um and I'm guilty of doing this just as much as anybody is, because I think a lot of people will go either way on this. They might be set in stone or they could be completely free willy about it. But some people like to know what the ending is before they even sit down and start writing or filming or whatever it is. And then other people are just like, oh, we'll find out. We'll get there. It'll come to me as I'm going, and I'll just kind of ride the wave kind of deal. And I've done both. And I've found that it's more helpful for me to know where I'm going at
Yeah.
the end of the script, that to see the mile marker to get there, and then kind of have to walk myself backwards, because if I don't, I will start going on tangents with every little storyline, because it's that seduction of ideas. Like we talked about, oh, I have an idea for this movie, or I have an idea for that story, or I have an idea for this character. And you start following all those different threads, but you notice
Yeah.
that one person's going to Alabama, the other person's going to Japan, someone's going to Alaska. It's like we're not we're
Yeah.
we're
You
we're
can't.
defeating the purpose
You
of
can only do
storytelling here,
so
which
many
is,
threads. Yeah.
yeah, you got
Absolutely.
to focus the narrative. That's the point. Like a narrative is about being narrow, focusing in to illustrate a particular point. And if what you're doing is not in service of that point, that ending, whatever it may be, you're going to get lost and it's just a mess. It doesn't make sense. No one cares. That's the biggest thing that I think everybody, that a lot of amateur people don't really get is like, if your audience doesn't care, you have nothing. I don't care what big thing you're trying to say, whatever. If they don't care, you don't have anything. And if you don't make them care, if you don't inform them that you know what you're saying, you know where you're going, they're going to check out. And you're done. So for me, it's, yeah, I cannot do that tangent thing where it's just like go wherever it may be. I've got to have that ending, or more importantly, and this is hard to do, but is to nail down the theme of what my story, my film, whatever it may be, is about. If I can figure out if the story is about forgiveness or overcoming the odds, whatever it may be,
Yeah.
I can start figuring out from there. I can pull from that. But it's just one of those things where I've got to know where I'm going to even start. I forgot what your original question was.
No, it was probably something like that. No, because when you were talking about that, I was thinking about how I imagine writing a story, and lately the way I've been imagining it is sort of like, okay, I'm trying to I'm trying to get this satellite from Earth to reach like Pluto, right?
Mm.
I have to track the trajectory, I have to figure it out, but things happen on the way from Earth to Pluto.
Sure.
There are interstellar bodies I didn't expect to encounter, like asteroids or whatever.
Yeah.
I know where the path is going to take its detours. Like maybe we're going to spin around Mars for a second to pick up some speed, or swing by Jupiter. But I know where I want to go,
Mm-hmm.
and the and I think about it in this analogy because for me, the way that I'm thinking about stories and what makes a story can make a story interesting is how do things detour, and then how do you, like, it's in that detour where all the tension happens, right? Like,
Yep.
because people can generally, when they watch a story, they can see from the beginning, like, oh, okay, this is where it's going to end up later on. So you want,
More nowadays than ever
yeah,
before
unless, I
with
mean,
binge
because
watching and the, yeah.
unless you're M. Night Shyamalan and like you just want to make everything a twist ending, but at that point, it's like
Yeah.
people don't. That's not that interesting most of the time.
But even then they're expecting the twist.
Yeah.
Like I remember when Glass came out, everybody was like, "What's the twist going to be? There's going to be a twist. What's the twist going to be?" So they're waiting for the twist, and it's like, well, now we're in, expected territory again. It's not a detour. It's not surprising.
So when thinking about a story, I start thinking less about how it's going to start or how it's going to end, but more about where am I going to build all the tension? How am I going to build that tension? And how do I want to fake out resolving tension? Because you know what I mean? Like then it
Yeah.
becomes something else. Then it becomes a matter of um, an audience can get more invested of like, oh wait, so we're not done? Where's this going? I want to know more.
Yeah.
And you can burn that out for sure. Like you can easily
Sure.
burn that out if you never get to a resolution soon enough. But point being, I don't know if there is a point, but point being, I think that like in starting a project, it's good to know where you're going to stop, right? And it's good to know how you're going to stop. But it's also good to have an idea of like what is the fun thing you want to do in the middle? What is the like
Mm.
where do you want to play? Cuz like starting a
Yeah.
thing, the beginning isn't really play, the end isn't really play. It's all in the middle. You know what I mean? Like
Sure.
usually ending, like especially if it's a story, ending it feels like, okay, fine, put up the sign, we're closed, like move on. Like
You ain't got to go home, but you can't stay
yeah.
here.
And then
Yeah.
starting a project, it feels like, you know, it feels like pulling teeth.
It's like
And
it's kind of like when you open a business and you're like, "Hey, come in. Hello, come in." It's like the guys in New York City that come up to you. Do you like comedy? Do you like comedy? Do you like comedy? It's like trying to rein in things. So
Yeah.
yeah, but then once you get them in the theater, it's like, all right, now we can have some fun. So I get exactly what you're saying, where it's like play in the swimming pool,
Yeah.
like throw your toys
So
around the sandbox.
that's where, like, lately, that's for me, like, when I'm about to start the day, I'm trying to get myself focused less on how am I going to start, and just think about when I'm in the middle of this, it's going to be awesome because I'll be in the zone. And that's what I want to be. Like, that's what every artist is looking for, is to be in that point of, like, they're in the zone, the words are flowing from their fingers like water,
Oh yeah,
like, everything's clicking. And it doesn't happen every day, but that's what you're shooting
no,
for, right? Like, that's
yeah.
what you aim for. So I
I usually when I'm writing, like when
yeah.
I'm doing something, like if I know an awesome thing is coming up, like the next scene is going to be something I've been really looking forward to, and I'm getting towards the end of my day. I know a lot of people's inclination is, I don't care, I want to write that scene right now. I stop. I don't write that scene that day because I know that scene that I'm looking forward to writing so bad. If I sit down to start writing tomorrow and that's the scene that I'm writing, then I will continue on past it. So it's kind of like a little life hack where I'm just like, oh, I'm going to set myself up for some momentum tomorrow because that's when I want to start. Have you ever
That's
done that
interesting. I've actually, what you're talking about, I've heard somebody else talk about, and they use it as a trick. And it's apparently like a neurological phenomenon, where, or psychological phenomenon, where if you, the person who I originally heard this idea from was a writer, and he was saying what he would do is he would stop writing in the middle of the sentence. And it was easier for him to
Oh,
pick back up from that point, because his brain will immediately start to fill in the gap and then go from there. Like, he can
so
immediately
I'm a
pick up
little bit, yeah. I have a little bit more OCD than that. I can't stop in the middle of a sentence. I
yeah.
got to finish out the scene, but it's the same concept basically. It's just scale back a little bit.
Yeah.
Um but yeah, I mean that's a good way to kind of keep momentum going. Is there anything else you want to throw out about getting something started? Because I think we've run over our normal time. Not that
Yeah.
our wonderful listeners don't love us going overtime. But if there's anything else that I haven't touched on that maybe you wanted to bring up, let's go for it now, or otherwise let's wrap this
Trying
bitch
to
up.
think, because I feel like I feel like we covered this from every angle that I can think of. Do you have any other angles that you can think of, Jow?
I think that's basically everything. We've talked about inspiration, we've talked about momentum, we've talked about just general prep, we've talked about uh, maintaining momentum, exploring ideas, exploring detours. I think, and I like to jump on this topic all the time. I think one of the best things about when you start is that you have to approach it. And I think we touched upon this in a previous podcast. You have to approach your project with enthusiasm and love for it, but zero expectation.
Yeah.
I think that's the best thing because in terms of you being grounded, um, and this is more of a not so much an artist technique or an execution thing, but just a personal, like a life hack in terms of how you're perceiving your work to go into your new project. It's the new year, you're starting a new project, you're jazzed about it. Don't tell anybody you're doing it yet. For one, it will spare you the embarrassment of having to answer people when they're like, "Hey, whatever happened to that thing you were doing that you may or may
Yeah.
not have abandoned or you're still working on or whatever?" But I found that setting your expectations low when you enter a project, not so much low, but having no expectations really can
Yeah.
help
Absolutely.
in those moments later on when people discover what you've been doing and they're jazzed about it, and all of a sudden that energy, you find that spark again because it's a new discovery for them like it was at one point for you. If you
Yeah.
oversaturate people about your idea and you tell them about it so much, whatever, they know about it, they got it, it's done. But when it's a new idea to them, we talked about the communal environment, that atmosphere of everybody working. When you reveal what you've been working on to someone and it's so old and mundane and dull to you, but it's
Yeah.
new to them, that spark can catch you on fire like nothing
Yeah,
has
that's
ever
interesting
done
that you bring
before.
that up too, because that reminds me of a couple of classes that I had in art school, and even prior to that, where there would be like critique day, right?
Yeah.
And
My favorite day. I loved critique day.
and there was always like this moment where like there were students in my class where I was like ready to see what they did. And there was also like there was a period of time, I think this was actually the class where I think I met you in Matt. It was the 3D design
I was
class.
gonna say that's what I thought it was. 3D
There
design. Yeah.
was this moment that I remember that was kind of a big spark for me, where I had made like this three like what was it? It was a maquette basically. It was like a sculpture, and the whole theme was like merge two opposite things together. So like I did this thing
I
that's
remember the
like
assignment. That was our final, I
Mega Man
believe. Yeah.
and Hulk, and there was this moment because I had it in a box and nobody could see what it was, and I did that purposefully because like I want the
Yeah.
big unveiling. And so there was this
Yeah.
moment where people were like, "Oh, I can't wait to see what this is," and like that gave me a thrill. Like that's something that I'm
Yes.
constantly trying to reapproach, is how to like
Yep.
create that hype. Like that's a big
Yes.
inspiration for me, and something that I don't have as much as I used to, but for sure. What about for you,
I
Joe?
I wanted to touch on this, that thrill, because starting a new project, you can get the thrill from the last thing that you accomplished or the last project you finished.
Yeah.
So when you're talking about I wanted to chase that thrill, you were there when we premiered Digits.
Yeah.
Um, and we got the standing ovation and everybody was applauding and this and that, and the laughs had gone over in the theater. Like when we made a comedy, the number one thing I thought of was, oh my God, what if no one laughs? What if it's not funny? What if it's boring? What if it's da 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 da? And when we got that when we got people laughing in the theater, I was like, all right, we're good. And by the time we got to the end of it, when everybody was applauding and cheering and so on and so forth, that feeling in the front of that theater, when I stood in front of that theater, I was so proud of myself, of the cast, of everybody that worked on it. But I was so thrilled to have that validation that it just like I think the next day I went home and I started writing a script for Digits 2 because it was like boom, I want to keep this momentum going, that energy, that power. But the best way that I've found to get that thrill, and this is kind of what you did by putting a box over it, is shattering the expectations of other people. Because when people were coming to see Digits, I don't think, and I obviously I can't. I'm biased. I have my own subjective experience and perspective of this, but
Yeah.
I don't think anyone in that theater that hadn't seen the movie or clips or this or that knew what I was capable of in terms of executing a film. They thought it was going to be like a home movie stitched together or this or that. But when they saw that it was more well put together than they had expected, that to me, that fuck you that I like giving to people. So
Yeah.
like when I'm working on something, I like it's not a motivating factor for me, but I do get the thrill off of it of shocking people's expectations of what I as an artist am capable of. And sometimes that will give me a little jolt of energy of like, oh, wait till they see this. This is, you know what I mean? And that will kind of keep me going. That's like some extra gas in the tank. At times when I'm starting to run low, it's like, you know what? No, they don't think I can do a claymation movie, but watch me do this claymation movie and be the best fucking thing they've ever seen. Like
In,
that gets me going, man.
for
So
sure,
when I
and I
nail
would
a project, yeah,
I think for myself, I'll finish off by saying that just recently actually, and I ended up taking a picture of it because it ended up being like one of these things that I'm like, okay, I need to save this for inspiration for like the days when I'm like I just can't get started.
yeah,
In the comments thread for like my most recent episode of Trailer Park Warlock, I don't know why this landed the way that it did, but somebody wrote, anyone else save this webtoon for last, like for dessert? And I was just like, fuck, I feel inspired suddenly because like now suddenly there are people
that's
who are
awesome.
reading it who are like, what it reminds me of, actually, is it reminds me of the way that I would read Foxtrot in the Sunday papers. I would read all the other comic strips and then read Foxtrot last because Foxtrot was my favorite one. And I wanted to save the best for last. And so, like,
Yeah.
when I read that comment, I was like, oh, that's kind of awesome. And, like, there was a bunch of other people who were agreeing with that comment. So I was like, well, that I felt chuffed, you know? Like, I felt totally like, I'm going to have to come back to that later because I'm going to need that one day when I'm staring at the, like, blank page and I need to get started and I need some kind of, like, something to ignite the gears,
That
basically.
that's like the biggest compliment, not so much to the comic, but to you
Yeah.
as the artist, because what they're saying is not only is what you're creating good, but it's almost like you can't fuck up dessert. It's really hard to fuck up dessert. And the thing about it is like they're trusting you to be, um, oh, what's the word I'm looking for here? Consistent in
Yeah,
terms of the
trust is the
quality.
big.
Like they trust that that's going to be good. So if dinner sucked, maybe they're going to try a new entree, but they know dessert's going to be good because you can't. It's hard to fuck up dessert,
Right.
and you have like honed in, you've nailed, you've hit the vein on something that, and you're continuously killing it, and that's why they're like, yeah, I'm gonna read this. It could be hit or miss or whatever like that, but then they're like, I'm gonna wrap up my reading with Trailer Park Warlock because I know it's gonna be good, and I can leave on that positive note. You know what I mean? Like
Right.
that's what everybody wants when they go to a movie or when they watch a TV show. They want to enjoy the work. Nobody goes into something unless they're a critic wanting to hate it or dreading it. You know what I mean? Like most
Yeah.
of the time, or unless you're like, you know, on a date and the person you're on a date with wants to see this terrible movie or something you're not looking forward to. But you know, and not to drag this podcast out even longer, that's something that can set your expectations sometimes because we need to talk about this. And I'm sorry if I'm dragging this podcast on longer. I don't know if you remember this, Mr. Rainwater, but you fucked me up. You dragged
With
me.
what?
You know where I'm going with this?
I don't. I can't. Not currently. I'll probably in a little bit.
You dragged me kicking and screaming almost to the point where I was just dumping on this movie up until the point that it started playing in front of us when we were together at college. Speed Racer, the live
Oh
action Speed
yeah,
Racer.
that movie. Yeah, that movie was hype.
I was so anti going to see that movie in every freaking way possible. And you were like, Jow, shut up. We're going to see this movie. None of that. So, and me as a filmmaker, I will go and see literally anything.
Yeah.
But I was dragging my feet to go see it. And you dragged me to it. And it's like one of my favorite movies now. It's got to be in the top 20 of my favorite movies because of the thrill, the visuals, the spectacle, all that.
Yeah.
It was fun. And I could not believe that my expectations, again, were so low. And it completely took me by surprise. So I guess
Yeah.
there's something to be said about low expectations and high expectations
For
because
sure.
when they go into yours, they go in with high expectations and you always deliver. And that's just pressure on you. But
Right.
that kind of thing is good when you're an artist and you feel down. So, like, you know, you lose a job or you break up with somebody or something bad happens in your life.
Yeah.
You can look back at that comment, though, that they said where they treat your comic like dessert because it's so good. And that's a good thing. Um, and then at other times, people can go into my movie and be like, I know Jow. He talks a lot of shit about movies. This is going to suck. And then I blow their fucking mind with what I'm capable of doing.
Yeah.
And you know what I mean? So like I guess
Yeah.
it's
Absolutely.
that kind of dual mentality of how people's expectations can play into an artist and how they I guess it's as an artist it's how you use that information to create. I create it.
Absolutely.
I know that when people come in with low expectations, I have a better chance of getting that Jurassic Park moment from them. That moment of wow, I didn't know, I wasn't expecting this. And then for you, it's like it's almost like I guess you could say a motivating factor where it's like, all right, I can't fuck this up. You're on that high wire almost.
It's a motivating factor also in the sense that I have to start thinking about how am I going to outdo what I did previously? Because that, yes, it's pressure, but it also becomes sort of like fuel in the sense of like, okay, now I'm in competition with myself. Like now I'm like in the middle of this tennis game with my past, and so now I have a bar, or not a bar. I'm trying to think of what the right word is, but I have like a path to go down that I've like there's territory I've already covered, so like where do I go next? And where do I and how do I explore that territory in a way that is like different but not just crappy. Like not just like uninteresting or whatever. Like it is interesting. It is like that's the point where I'm like engaged basically, you know. And it's not every day,
You're
but I mean,
invested.
yeah, I'm invested now because now there's something for me to outdo other than like somebody else's work.
It's
Which is also
about protecting your legacy. You know, Tarantino talks about his filmography or whatever like that, but and you had talked about this in a previous podcast, but your signature. It's about developing your signature more so, and as artists, we create. So if we stay in the same spot too long, we get bored and we fail.
exactly.
That's the thing, is
And
like
it'll show when
there's
you're
a different
bored.
type of failure for an artist. It's like there's two types of failure. There's the failure of trying something new, which to me is still a success, if that makes any kind of contradictory success
No, that
sense
makes
to
sense.
people.
Yeah.
But then there's the other kind of fail where it's like, oh, all you did was try to stay in your lane, in your same spot where it's safe. And that's the worst kind of fail. That's even worse than a cash grab or being derivative. Safety to an artist, I think, is the worst thing in the world. But now you're on that high wire where it's like you gotta juggle while walking the tightrope and dodging a shark, and there's lasers and there's a storm and there's a hurricane and there's a tidal wave and there's a jet bomber shooting at you. Like the more it's like, bring it on, bring the shit on. I want more. And it's almost like a death wish for an artist. And I think sometimes that's what happens to our heroes as artists. Like you look at like George Lucas. Do you think at any point in his mind he said, I wonder if I can fuck with this universally acclaimed movie so much that they'll hate me? They've gone
Oh,
from putting me on this
absolutely.
pedestal. If I add a CGI shark eating Luke Skywalker's foot at some point as some dorky joke, can I get away with this? And it's just like, you know, at some point, I guess it's a self-fulfilling prophecy that they just, you know, we all end up failing and fucking up at some point. But that thrill, chasing that thrill, man, that keeps me going after I get started sometimes, for sure.
Absolutely. That's definitely it for me.
But anyway, we are now 90 minutes plus into this podcast, and I think you guys have gotten some ideas. I hope if you've listened to this podcast, it's a couple days before New Year's. Don't even wait. That's something we didn't really talk about. Is like maybe trying to jump the gun. Don't wait for stupid reasons to start. Oh, I'll start once I have this, or once I do that, or da 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 da. Sit down and start. That's the hardest part of any kind of art project and being a self-starter. We were talking about this in the beginning. You just got to start, and once you start, it'll keep going and going and going.
January 1st is not the day to begin your New Year's resolution. In fact, do it right now. You can just put up you can put up this podcast, or you can keep it on. You could throw your phone away and just you're gonna try and learn how to do push-ups. Do it now. If you're gonna get that project started, do it now. Now's the time for sure.
I remember when I did my big weight loss thing, because I lost 100 pounds in a little less than a year. I was up to like 270 pounds and I got down to 170. And most people do their whole I'm going to lose weight thing January 1st. That's the New Year's resolution. Me, it was March 22nd. And I always remember that date from now on. And I was just tired of falling out of breath from tying my shoes. That's how overweight I was. I couldn't bend over and tie my shoes. And I was just like, fuck this. I'm done. And that very day, I stopped overeating. I started counting calories. I started walking on a treadmill. Da, 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 da. And 1 year to the day, March 22nd, a year later, I was down 100 pounds. And
Damn.
it had nothing to do with January 1st or this or that. The idea was I got started. So
Yeah.
if you're listening to this podcast, we're telling you right now, it's not New Year's Day. It's still 2020, the year everybody hated, supposedly. But you know what? Fuck it. Make it your bitch. Go and start whatever it is you want to start right now. Right now. This podcast is ending. You are starting. Go to AC Moore. Go on Amazon. Buy that art stuff. Go buy Final Draft. Whatever it is that you're going to do this year, start it right now. I don't care if it's 2 a.m. and you're about to go to bed. Do one thing that will
Yeah.
get you going so that tomorrow you can pick right back up. And I think that's where we should end and leave you guys alone so you can focus. Would you agree with that, Mr. Rainwater?
Yeah, I would agree with that for sure.
All right.
Later, y'all.